Welcome back for our Week 5 Roundup. It's amazing how fast the time has gone. We really can't believe we've only just 1 week left in the course, and we've been told that student participation for the course has been really high compared to some other online courses, so we genuinely appreciate so many of you are taking this learning journey seriously, both at an individual level, but also your willingness to participate in thinking about some really serious questions that impact all of our futures.
Now, as we near almost 6,000 students registered for the course, we've been humbled by your positive feedback. Now, if you feel like this course has been a good experience for you, please do share within your networks, as we think it's important as many people as possible think and debate these issues. Just recently, the United States announced that it would commence antitrust investigations against some large technology companies such as Amazon, Google, and Facebook, partly related to data privacy and overall size concerns. So we are already observing the real-world implications of the concepts that we've covered in our course.
Now, as you know, in Module 5, we discussed what we refer to as the decentralized future. Basically, we're trying to grapple with understanding how the future might look and how best we digital citizens can participate in crafting that future. Now, from the comments in the course forum, it seems like many of you have been thinking about similar questions. So we want to jump into a few of your comments.
So, Dave, let's start with our first question, which relates to kind of one of the first principles related to the module, which is, do you think that FinTech, do you think it'll bring the world together or drive it further apart? Where do you stand on that?
Okay, so regardless of where I stand, first I just wanted to point out, I thought it was cool when reading through some of the comments that you as the kind of course participants looked at this question very differently. So some of you said that it's going to bring the world closer together because it makes it easier to, for example, purchase things online, for digital payments, and basically saying like I can contact anyone and do almost anything from inside my own home. So that was kind of the digital connection. Whereas others of you said that by virtue of that digital connection, it is inherently driving the world further apart because you're not actually seeing people. Yeah, you're not going to the store. You're not going out and writing letters to people and whatnot. So I thought that in and of itself was a very interesting kind of dichotomy or paradox in the way they looked at it. So, and I think both are accurate. And neither one is necessarily good or bad, but both do come with, I think, kind of positive and negative aspects to it. Yeah. So there were some specific comments. So Ying 2658 said that FinTech brings distant people together, but pushes further for people around us. I mean, I think what Ying was saying is that it can connect people from around the world, but the people that are close to us are in some circumstances actually pushed further away. Or is the way that some have said it is that we are actually looking at kind of our digital friends at the exclusion of our actual in-person friends. Have you seen something like that?
Well, I think the first part about how we're more connected to communities that are farther away, I think that was the original what people thought were the benefits of globalization. So if you look back and look at people like Thomas Friedman, who was a New York Times columnist, he's a New York Times columnist, wrote, The World is Flat, and wrote this book that was a bestseller, I think 10, maybe 15, 20 years ago. This is basically what he's talking about, where, we used to be just heavily, our relationships were heavily constrained by the people we could meet physically, and now that's not the case, and we see that, and so I think that aspect certainly is occurring. I do think on the flip side, where it's the people who are more proximate to us physically, where those relationships may kind of not be as strong, we're definitely seeing aspects of that too, and we see that in aspects of people thinking about. Even like video game addiction, for example, right? And the lack of interaction that occurs in real life because people are on devices.
Yeah.
And so those kind of activities, I guess, I think what a lot of people are getting to, but even everyday occurrences, right? And so in places like China where there are super apps where people are getting food delivered, even like coffees delivered, right? Where normally you might walk down to your neighborhood coffee shop or your Starbucks or whatever and have some even little interaction with the cashier, with somebody standing in line. Even those micro kind of interactions, I guess, are falling by the wayside now. And so I don't know if that implies any greater societal problem, perhaps.
Yeah.
But it's certainly something to think about and consider.
Yeah, and it's not FinTech specific, but there are a lot of studies that are coming out showing kind of from a psychological standpoint, mental health standpoint, even just general physical health standpoint, that we are going to have to adapt. We're going to have to maybe recognize some of these challenges. I think, on a very personal level, I've got 3 kids, you walk home, headphones are in, and everyone's doing their own thing. And it's cool from a certain extent because I feel like
You don't have to talk to your kids.
Well, yeah, I mean, there you go. Bonus. No, but they're connected with their family from all over the world. They live in a global community, so they're connected with people from all over the world. But then they're also learning things from all over the world, right? Like TED or edX and things that are really bringing people together from a knowledge standpoint. Yeah. But it is interesting how quite often my 12-year-old daughter will text me from across the room. Mostly for fun. I think she's kind of messing with me, but at the same time, that is a very real occurrence, I think. And so, we have to weigh the good with the bad, and from a culture lag perspective, I think kind of narrow that gap. So there was one other aspect of this that came out in terms of there was a comment from Judah Frankel, I'm not sure if Judah Frankel, and it was a really interesting comment, I think really spot on. He took the scenario of me being in rural Western China and trying to purchase breakfast and saying how, yes, recognizing there were perhaps some impediments and challenges in terms of using the technology to purchase the breakfast, but very insightfully also pointed out that had I just used cash, that also would have had a whole list of challenges, including the RMB is not convertible, so I would have to be able to go and have a bank account or some process whereby I could not only pull out currency, but actually convert the currency, et cetera, et cetera. And so his comment was, well, look, is this really any harder? And in fact, once you set up that technology, it gets easier and easier. And I do think that is accurate, really insightful even. And in my comment to him, the written comment, one of my points was simply that, well, it's not that one is necessarily better or worse. And indeed, I think we could all agree that many aspects of the electronic transactions are significantly simpler, right? Once you know how to do it, once you're in the ecosystem. And my point, though, to him was that just by virtue of the fact that it is different, by virtue of the fact that it is new, that means it's inherently going to be distant for some people. And it will make it hard, again, for perhaps the poor, or the elderly, minorities, migrants, and even tourists. Like you could have a wealthy tourist who's just not part of that ecosystem that has difficulty kind of accessing it. So, from that standpoint, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think the entry point I think is important. So, true, if you didn't, like the conversion, all that stuff that you mentioned, I think would have happened. But I'm sure if push came to shove, and this lady really wanted to sell you whatever she was selling you, and all you had were, U.S. dollars even, and she was taking cash, right? Let's assume she was accepting cash. And if you gave her enough U.S. dollars, she would probably give you. She would probably give you the food.
Do some dishes.
Right, and so I think the idea of entry point in terms of how we enter the ecosystem is important. So the barriers to entry for a cash economy are quite low. Right. So and it's not even constrained to just like, oh, you have to have that currency. So we were just talking before we started filming about the situation. I had a visa issue going to Vietnam. And it was so interesting because when you showed up at this particular airport in Vietnam, they were like, you had to get a picture for your visa. But people didn't have, Vietnamese dong or whatever, so they're like, oh, you got to give us $5. And people are like, well, I don't have any US dollars. Oh, give it to us in whatever currency you have. And, and that was just, it was okay because it was cash. And so I think, to your point, I think that's right. I think the barrier to entry is important to think about because there's a higher barrier to entry now in China for someone who's not in the system. Right?
Well, I would argue.
Right? And, which is my opinion as well, whereas in a pure cash economy, for example, or a hybrid where cash is still highly, readily accepted, the barrier to entry is still quite low.
And the only thing I would add as well, I agree with all that, is that because the infrastructure is in place already and has been for quite a long time, if you use the example of a tourist, if they get there, there are ATMs waiting for you, there's currency conversion, they're kind of waiting for you. And when you think of the mobile device, yes, it's easy to use, doesn't take very long, but the reality is, like for, as you said, the barrier to entry for a poor person to access cash versus acquiring and using a mobile phone is actually quite significant. And we're very far from the time when there will be mobile phones waiting for us at the airport like an ATM, right? Because it's not like one machine can do all that for everyone like an ATM or a currency conversion kiosk could do. So again, great points. I'm sure as time goes on, people are going to look at my scenario and actually look at the cash as probably the more archaic, time-consuming thing. Oh my gosh, like they actually had to go through that process. But for now, I think for a lot of us out there, there is a little bit of a barrier to entry in terms of the technology. And so, we'll see as that adapts and kind of changes going forward. Okay, so the next kind of question or theme that we wanted to go through was this concept of cryptocurrency, and particularly in terms of a potential decentralized future. Now, we asked, do you think that banks and potentially even governments would move more in the crypto direction? And if they do, will that lead to a more entrenched kind of traditional forms of power, meaning the banks and governments just use that and get stronger? Or is this going to lead to a more decentralized future the way the kind of founders and geniuses behind these cryptocurrencies originally envisioned? So Dave, what do you think?
Well, that's a pretty heavy question, and I don't think we have kind of the full answer.
Nobody does.
Yeah, and if anything, that's probably at least 3 or 4 different questions that are encompassed in
fair.
that. But I think maybe we start with kind of a recent news event and then kind of start unpacking it from there. So I think it's probably most of our participants have read in the newspaper or magazines or online blog or wherever, is that Facebook has recently kind of shared their plans to launch their own kind of stable coin, which my understanding will be tied to basically a basket of different currencies, and they're taking basically $10 million investments from a variety of different types of stakeholders, so financial companies, other technology companies, etc. And
this is huge, by the way.
Yeah, which is huge.
That's crazy.
Because if they do roll it out across all of their messaging platforms, Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, and Instagram, in theory they should have the largest payment network in the world.
And we should point out this is happening because of this course. Like, we pushed it. No, I'm just kidding.
So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, right? And so what kind of influence that has on how governments as well as individuals perceive these kind of payment systems, and
how governments will perceive Facebook.
Yeah,
this could
exactly.
Be,
and so this is a core question, because I think we had mentioned at the beginning, at the outset of the Roundup, that they're kind of undergoing some scrutiny related to antitrust.
Yeah.
And this alone, this new stable coin that they're producing alone would not trigger antitrust violations by itself. But I think in that kind of overall political environment, again, it's another kind of red flag that politicians and regulators will draw on to say, hey, how should we be treating you guys? Should we be treating you like a utility, which is something I'm sure we're going to discuss in a second here. But should you be treated like a bank? I mean, if you have a network that allows a few hundred million people to trade payment,
like leverage requirements or something.
And the reality is that you can actually hold that value in some way. So in a sense that you're acting like a bank, should you be subject to similar scrutiny as a financial institution, right?
Yeah.
And so this raises a lot of questions on the regulatory front, and maybe maybe a lot of large technology companies, I think at the high level when they talk about this, they don't want to be regulated like that.
Of course,
right?
Yeah.
But maybe
they don't want to be any of those things. Antitrust, utility.
That's right.
Like they don't want any of those things. Yeah.
But if the decision is made, it's going to happen, then you start thinking about kind of the side effects of that, right?
Yeah.
Does that become a standalone business? Does that stay part of Facebook when they get regulated? And would even if they did get regulated, so my question when it comes down to it, where people talk about, it should be regulated like a utility, it should be regulated like a financial institution, that's all fine. And let's say that happens, but does that automatically mean that it won't be as big and influential as it is today? If anything, I feel like that can potentially give them a license to even be bigger and more influential.
Yeah, I mean, because if you think about utilities are traditionally kind of monopolies or some type of cartel.
Yeah.
I mean, you have this limitation on how many utilities you can have. An interesting side note to that is utilities are usually very geographically specific. It's not like there's going to be a world utility anytime soon. And so what does that even mean? If you did it from the U.S. context, I mean, would every single country regulate them separately, which is probably the likely future.
At least in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and I mean, it's going to be super interesting, and I have no idea how they're going to deal with this. I do know that, as we've seen even earlier in the course, I think we may have talked about it, but Mark Zuckerberg and his entire team are trying to get out in front of this. He, of course, published an op-ed in the Washington Post about this, saying, we know we're probably going to have to be regulated more. Here's what we think that should look like. You have the COO of Facebook is reaching out and publicly stating that regulating it more, or breaking it up would be a nightmare for everybody. I mean, they're really trying to get out there and kind of lobby, not only actually lobbying for the government, but actually lobbying to the public, saying like, this is why you should keep us together. There's a great article recently, I think it was New York Times, where it showed the behind the scenes lobbying that big tech firms, mostly from Silicon Valley, the amount of lobbying pressure they're placing on Washington, D.C. right now, trying to kind of like massive amounts of money going in to kind of like, I guess, drive the dialogue and push that, their story, their narrative.
And the interesting, I think, dynamic that's occurring there is one, I think they've been preparing for this for a while.
Oh yeah. Oh
and
yeah.
So in terms of bringing over folks who have some expertise in, kind of antitrust, regulatory action and things like that. But I think the other thing that is really interesting is most of these, at least as far as the U.S. political spectrum goes, most of these technology companies that we're talking about tend to be liberal. Yet most of the folks who are bringing up this regulation are also liberal politicians. And so it's a very interesting dynamic that it's occurring, and it will be interesting to see how it plays out.
Well, and just to give you a specific example, I think San Francisco is super interesting in this regard, because you have one of the most liberal cities in the United States, with one of the kind of highest per capita income cities in the U.S., where is largely the home of, or at least nearby, for many of these technology firms. And yet, what do you see? The state of California recently put in rules against kind of the gig economy, saying that companies like Uber are going to have to treat them like employees. You have facial recognition being banned throughout San Francisco, and so it's this interesting dichotomy. In fact, on a more personal level, you see there's all these reports of Apple and other very senior technology executives that intentionally send their kids to school that don't use digital
devices,
technology, right? So it's just interesting, this kind of dichotomy.
And so I guess more to the broader question then, like, will governments and central banks really ever give up this idea of central currency? I don't think so. I mean, a large part of what their fiscal policy, large part of monetary policy, large parts of other types of government policy that deal with kind of government revenue and things, all tie into this idea that they have control over money supply, they can print money, they have control over interest rates, and again, different countries have different systems. So we're just talking broadly here. Would governments ever give that up? Not willingly.
Yeah, of course.
Right. And if we use
they'll want to control, they will probably allow it, but it's going to be like defined on their own terms for their own benefit.
So if we use a non-technological example, my mind comes the European Union, whereas countries joined the Union from an economic perspective, they lost economic sovereignty related, which led to some problems for some of the countries in the Union right now.
For sure,
Right, and so I think if we apply that through a technological lens, then would there be some of the same issues? Surely, I think. And so I think governments are hesitant to potentially walk down that road without knowing. I don't think anybody wants to be first. I don't think any major economy at least wants to be first.
Well, and I would say if there was one, kind of, speaking with a guy about this recently, I could definitely foresee the U.S. pushing this, especially with large U.S. financial institutions, in order to ensure the first mover status and kind of ensure the U.S. dollar kind of remains the world's kind of fiat currency. Because if you did have a U.S. backed dollar, crypto going forward, and especially if it's like broadly adopted, that could potentially give them like a further extension as like the global currency.
And so I think the next iteration of this, in my mind, or the next step of this towards merging traditional fiat with a wider spread use of various forms of crypto will be some sort of stable coin. So like what Facebook's doing with Libra, stable coins that maybe a particular financial institution puts out that is maybe pegged to a US dollar or a basket of currencies that are heavily traded like yen, euros, whatever. And then you could see that actually being like a partial next step to how countries and economies try to merge the fiat and cryptocurrency divide.
Do you think the name that Facebook chose for the crypto is kind of interesting? Like Libra, I mean, I'm assuming, is it Libre?
Libra.
R-A. Yeah. Okay, so I may be completely off here. I'm assuming it's based on like freedom and liberty. Is that?
That was my impression.
Yeah. Because we've seen that. We've seen the Marshall Islands currency was specifically talking about sovereignty. Right, and so it's interesting that even in the way that they're naming these coins, a lot of them are kind of focusing on this idea of freedom and democratization of finance. Again, I may be off on the Facebook thing. We'll find out. I'm sure someone's going to Google this and let us know. One thing that I, personally, I'd like to see, we keep talking about a utopian future. And on this particular topic, I think one of the most interesting ideas, if we do go into the route of a public utility, and if we do say that since these really, really large kind of tech fin platforms, I guess by global comparison, only serve a small number of stakeholders. There's fewer employees, right? They're really like creating massive amounts of wealth for a small number of people. Then if you do kind of look at it from what's known as the UBI, Universal Basic Income standpoint, could you have these massive companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Tencent, or whatever that are essentially like either nationalized or created like utilities where part of that wealth is actually pulled off and then given down to normal people in countries around the world? So there's actually a presidential candidate in the US right now who's running in large part based on this concept of UBI, Universal Basic Income. And he said part of that funding, of course he's not going to win, but it's an interesting idea that part of that funding would come from essentially taxing these large organizations, which for the most part don't pay any federal income tax. Now as we wrap up this roundup, just a quick administrative announcement. For our verified learners who are pursuing a certificate, the final assignment is in the next module. In this assignment, we want you to utilize the framework and knowledge we have introduced in the course to analyze a FinTech product or solution of your choice. Now, we hope this serves as another wonderful opportunity for you to learn from other excellent peers from all over the world. And so accordingly, the essay is going to be peer assessed. Now, each of you will grade 2 other peers' work and also receive 2 sets of grades and feedback. And we can't wait to read your great work and wish you the best as you progress to earning your certificate.
Now, thank you again for being part of this learning journey. It's been a great experience for both of us, and we hope you enjoy the final module and look forward to wrapping up the course with you next week.